Ford designed the lower end of this twin cam engine, and with it, one of the craziest water pump designs you'll ever encounter. But I'm fixing that today with a replacement kit from Mountune. Hey, I'm Matt, and welcome back to Westcam. All right, we are picking up where we left off yesterday. The crank is in. I got a comment, hey, don't forget you got to put assembly lube on the main journals. Thank you for that. They had assembly lube on it. I failed to mention it in the video, so I apologize for that, and you were right to call it out. And we're going to go ahead and install these thrust washers. Now on the thrust washer, there's two sides. One has oil grooves, and you can see them right there and there. Those grooves always face away from that journal, toward the crank. And basically you start one side and you drop it in, and it just kind of finds its way around that crank and sits down in there. Now when it comes to thrust washers, there are two in this engine, just like the 907 and 910, 912. Don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that one goes on the bottom, one goes on the top. They're not set up that way. They actually both go down into the block. One is on one side of the journal, the other's on the other side of the journal, and the oil grooves always face away from the journal. So that's how you know you're getting these thrust washers in there correctly. Now I need to move this crank forward so I have enough room to slide this one in. And you do always want to put assembly lube on these, because the crank is rotating against it, so you've got two friction surfaces. So I'm going to drop this in. And I've already measured the clearances here, and I know these are correct, so I'm not going to do that again. Okay, thrust washers are in. Perfect! Now we're going to put the caps on, and bearings are in. Bearings are lubed up. Plenty of assembly lube. I'm going to start at the rear. I'm just placing them for now. Just to get them in place. There's an arrow on the top of each one of these caps. They always point toward the front of the engine. And they're actually also labeled from the factory with front, rear, rear 2, center, rear 4. So it's helpful. You can also mark them on your own when you take the engine apart if you want to do that. Now, I'm not going back with the Lotus supplied cap bolts here. I'm using the ARP bolts, and I've got these lubed up with the ARP lube. The only thing you really got to know about these is there's a chamfer on one side of the washer. That chamfer always goes toward the head of the bolt. And then, of course, you lube the washers under the head of the bolt and the threads. You want to use ample lube on all of that. Now, the factory torque specs for the main cap bolts is 60. However, when you go with ARP, you're not looking at the factory anymore. You're looking at the recommendations of the bolt manufacturer. That's ARP. Their recommendations for these bolts in this engine is 80 foot-pounds. Pretty typical. They do the same thing on the 907s and the 910s. The torque sequence is the same. They're always going to refer you back to the manufacturer's specifications for torque sequence. However, the torque is going to be different. So you go to the part manufacturer for the torque specs. So I'm just going to run these down quickly to snug them up, and then we'll torque them. Okay, they're snug. We're going to switch over the torque wrench. I'm going to do it in 3 stages. I'm going to start 30. I'm going to go 30, 60, 80. I like to go down evenly, so I'm not going to torque 1 to 30 right away. All right, there's 30. Let's jump up to 60. And finally, we're going to go to 80. All right, here we go. She spins nice and freely. Feels great. All right. About torquing these down, I got to share something. A lot of folks call me up when they use these ARP, either the head studs and the 910s or the bolts with the washers. And with this lubricant, they'll say, hey, I got really nervous. I was torquing them down and I could feel it giving way. You're torquing, let's say you're going to 80, you're close, and suddenly it slips. And then it gets tight again and you go to 80. Well, that's normal with these bolts. I think what's happening, you're not tearing the threads out of the block, and that's what everybody's afraid of. And they stop and they're like, I'm not going any tighter. I'm freaking out. I think I'm going to ruin the block. But I think what's happening, the washers in the head are just seating and they're slipping independent of each other. And that's what you feel at that particular time. So don't freak out about that. That's normal. I felt it when I was doing this. And I actually felt it when I was just getting to 60 foot-pounds. It's normal. It's okay. Keep going. I think the torque has been proven acceptable over and over and over again. So you're good. Stop freaking out about that and just torque those suckers to the spec they're supposed to go to. All right? All right, cranks in. Next, we're going to focus our attention on pistons. I've assembled 3 of them. I put the rods back in the pistons themselves. The rods were all balanced in both directions, and they are super tight, super balanced, so it's going to be great for this engine. I left one unassembled, and I'll show you why. So let's flip the motor over, and let's talk about pistons and piston rings, and we're going to gap those rings and install the pistons. All right, time to hit the rings. So, new rings, Hastings rings. Already got them out of the package. These are the number 1 rings, the number 2, the number 3. And I will show you how I do these. But first, looking in the manual, on the compression ring, the number 1, I'm looking for 0.009 to 0.014. All right, so I'm going to take the ring and I'm going to slide it in. Now what you want to do is you want this very square in the bore so you can get an accurate gap reading. And the way I do that is I remember I told you I didn't assemble one of these pistons and rod combinations for a reason, because I want this to square up that ring. So I've left the old oil compression oil ring on here. And what I'm going to do is just push this down, let it bottom out on that ring, and now I know that that ring is squared in the bore, and it's just over a ½ an inch down, which is about right where it should be. So now I'm going to measure the gap in here on my trusty feeler gauge. I'll start with 009. That goes, that's good. I'm going to jump to 011. I can still fit that. 013. Yeah, I'm going to call that 013. That's actually within spec between 009 and 014. So that's good. I don't have to gap it. It came from the factory pretty good. So that one checks out. But now we got to keep them organized. So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to set the number 2 rings aside because I want to keep the number 1s in order. So this is my number 1 ring, number 1 cylinder. Put that there. Now let's try the second one. Yeah, 012 fits in nicely. We're within spec of the number 1 compression ring, so that is good. Well, that's a first. Honestly, when I do the Esprit engines, the 910s and the 907s, I always have to end up gapping them. They're always too small from the factory. Surprisingly. Now, I did have this block honed, so potentially that took off a little bit from the cylinder liners, and maybe the last time it was honed as well. However, when I mited the bores, they were all within a thou of factory, 1 to 1.5 thou. All right, so here's where we are. compression between 09 and 04. So I've got going from number 1 to number 4, 013, 012, 013, 012. All kind of leaning toward the higher side, but we didn't get to 014, so we're not maxed out. That's good. On the second ring, spec is 010 to 020. Number 1 was 018, 2 was 017, 3 was 018, 4, 020. So 4 is right at that upper limit. Interesting. I'm kind of surprised, like I said. Usually they're not within spec right out of the box. Maybe these were pre-gapped. I'm not sure. But hey, I'm not knocking it. I'll take it. So I'm going to call the rings good. And now we can assemble this final piston. We can put the rings on. We're going to oil the heck out of them. Compress the rings, and we're going to put them in the block, and we're going to get the bearings in and button this up. All right, let's assemble this last rod. I've got to take the old ring off. Highly recommend you guys use these ring install tools to remove and to put them on. It's just too much risk. If you try to put them on without it, you could twist them, you could distort them, you can scratch the piston. Just a lot of good doesn't come from that. All right, so here's our rod back from the machine shop. All these rods measured within 1/2 gram. I think Lotus tolerance is like 3 to 6 grams, but we are within 1/2 gram, which is amazing. You know, I'll offer this too. Of all the rods and cranks from Lotus that I bring into the machine shop, there's some of the best balanced engine components that the machine shop sees. You just stock out of a 50-year-old engine. These things, I mean, Lotus really dialed it in when it came to balancing crankshafts and balancing rods and doing all that. They did a very good job with that. I talked to the machine shop guy. He's like, you bring me in anything American from the 70s, it's like it's all over the place. He's shocked every time he does a crank. The one in this motor, now granted it had been rebuilt before, but this thing mic'd in within 1/2 gram of balance. Unbelievable. Okay. Lube, assembly lube, lots of it. And we'll put some in the piston. Both sides. Work it around really well. And for good measure, I'll put it on the pin as well. There's a correct orientation for this. It's pretty simple, no magic. Each piston is inscribed with something that says front, and each rod is inscribed with something that says front. So, front, front, they go together like this. So just make sure that those fronts are all on the same side of the assembly, and you're in good shape. And I'm just going to slide it all the way through, and then try to push it with my finger the rest of the way. So she's in there. Now I've got the 2 clips, and these get tiresome after a while. I do these with my hand. It's doable, but if you do a bunch of them in a row, your fingers are going to be hurting. But anyway, it is doable. All right, we got our new bearings as well, and this was all installed earlier before going to the machine shop, and I did the bore clearances, and I mic'd the crank, and our oil clearances are all within spec, so we're good to go. So here we can just focus on assembly, and we don't have to do we don't have to mic it right now and do the bore gauge and all that, because we know we're good. All right, so next step is really to put the rings on the pistons. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Always start with the lowest ring first. These are 3-part oil rings. All right, so I'm not orientate the rings right now on the pistons. I'm going to do that once I'm ready to put them in. So right now I'm just putting them on. All right, we're going to go to the number 2 ring now, and the groove faces down. You'll see a little groove if you look at the cross section, and that groove faces down. And now the number 1. The number 1 Does not say top or bottom. So it's symmetrical both ways. All right, here we go. Now we just need to do that for the other 4. All right, boss says my break is over, so I'm back at it. Let's get the rings set up correctly on the pistons. So the way we want to think about this is, that's the front of the motor, this is the back. I'm going to call that 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Intake side is 3, exhaust is 9 o'clock. The exhaust is the major thrust side. The intake is the minor thrust side. You never want a ring gap facing 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Now, the way we're going to gap these rings is, I'm looking at the motor from the back. So let's just talk about number 1. So let's do the bottom rings first. The expander, or the spacer on the oil rings, goes to 12 o'clock. And then the smaller rings on either side of that are 1 degree off of that. So we're going to go 11 and 1 on those. The compression, the top ring, we want at 2 o'clock. So that's away from the major thrust side, and it's away from the 3 o'clock position of the minor thrust. And then finally, for the oil control ring, we want that one at 8 o'clock. So 6, 7, 8. So again, we're on the exhaust side, but we're not at the 9 o'clock position. We want to stay away from that. So that's how I'm going to gap all these rings, because as I turn them in my hand, it's going to be really hard for you to see. But this is the number 1 piston. This is the front, so it goes this way. So I'm going to take that oil ring, and I am going to set the gap in that facing that way. Now, each smaller ring on top of the oil ring, I want to offset by 1 degree. Do the top ring, we're going to position that at 2 o'clock. And the second ring, we're going to position at 8 o'clock. Second one's at 8. And put the top one back at 2. All right, that's the correct orientation of the rings. We're going to do them all just like that. I hope that made sense. All right, now we just need to put the bearings in. So you got 8 bearing halves. 4 have holes, 4 do not. The ones that have holes, you line up with the hole in the connecting rod right there. That's the oil feed. And the ones in the caps get the solid shells without the hole. So I've got the crank. I put plenty of assembly lube on the main journals. I'm going to spin it over now. What I also want to do is, I'm going to start with the number 1. I'm going to rotate the crank so that that crank journal is up and centered in this bore. So when I tap this piston and rod down, it's going to go right over the journal of the crankshaft. Let's put some assembly lube on the bearings as well. This is by far my least favorite part of the engine assembly, because it gets really messy. And I've tried to do it using rubber gloves, but things get really, really slick really fast. So I'm going to do it without gloves today and see how it goes. But we're ready to put number 1 in. All the rings are oriented correctly. I've got my ring compressor. I've got a rubber mallet to tap. So let's try. I have this tray here because I'm going to pour a lot of oil on these. And actually I want to put this tray under the engine block because this gets messy. Alright, number 1. So we're really going to soak this. Really get it everywhere. It's just a tricky process. Okay, it's tight, but I'm still not ready to push it yet because it's not square to the piston. So what I do is I drop this in. I'm not going to tap the piston. I'm tapping the compressor to square it up. If you're not squared up, that ring's going to pop out when you try to push that piston in, and you're not going to be very happy. So now that it's squared up, let's give it another, see if I can tighten it. Oh, she's good. All right, front is facing front. So now I'm going to lightly tap her in. Here we go. Now what I want to do is turn the motor over because I want to put the cap on and just loosely attach that cap. So I'm going to put more assembly lube on the bearing and the cap. And there's a ton on the crank. So now I want to just drop this cap on. So the rod came right over the main journal of the crank, which is fantastic. Slide that cap on. And just get these started. So the rod bolts are 9/16. Just want to snug them up. Okay, they're snug. So let's rotate the engine again. And the great thing about 4 cylinders is if if the crank is rotated such that number 1 slid right on, number 4 will do the same. So we'll do that next. And then we rotate the crank and we'll do 2 and 3. I'm going to drop it in. Square up the compressor and we'll go down. All right, so that's the process. Now I need to turn this over, do the cap, rotate the crank, and do these other 2. And then we'll go from there. All right, all the caps are on. These get torqued to 45, so I'm going to go to 30 and then step it up to 45. That's 30. Now we're going 45. Here we go. Today we're moving on to the front cover and the water pump. I received, I mentioned earlier I was going to upgrade the water pump, and I did that. So I bought a water pump kit from Mountune, and they're here in the United States. They engineer and manufacture it there, and the quality seems to be really good. Here's the actual water pump mechanism itself. If I take these, I laid out the bolts, I put the bolts in. I was trying to dry fit everything so I knew how to assemble it because this does not come with instructions. But really nice water pump. Bearing is fantastic. Just the feel of it, the milling on the aluminum is great. Just made really, really well. So I'm happy about this. Now when I have to change the water pump in the future, I just unbolt this and make the change and bolt it back in. So that's so much better than the original design. All right, so that's the pump itself. It comes with a back cover, which is very similar to the original Lotus cover. However, they've got some different machining here for an O-ring that goes in to seal that water pump. And here is the rest of the cover. So it sits like that on the engine. And, if you're running an Elan, I guess you're going to use this. But in the case of the Europa, that is blocked off. Maybe it's blocked off on the Elan too. I don't really know. But this is the port I'm going to be using for coolant. So, and it comes with its own bearing or oil seal. So that's great too. Other than that, it comes with the top end of the dipstick tube and all the nuts and bolts. It does not come with a gasket, and it didn't come with the crank pulley. So I have the gasket here. So the first thing I need to do is to assemble the back plate on with the gasket in the sealant and get that situated correctly, and then go ahead and we'll put the sprocket back on the jack shaft, which I did have to take off. Somebody commented on that. You were exactly right. I did have to take that off. But I can live with that. I can live with that. And after that, we'll put the front cover on, put the water pump on. So let's keep let's keep going with this. Alright, for sealant, if you read any Lotus manual, they kind of refer to well seal. However, I don't use it. I have it, but I don't use it. I was told, and I haven't seen it myself, but by a reputable source, that there was a service bulletin that came out from Lotus at one point, and they told the dealerships to stop using the well seal and switch over to the Toyota seal packing. So I've had tremendous success with this stuff. I like it a lot. You don't have to let it sit up for an hour before you torque it down. You put it on sparingly and you torque it down, and the stuff is fantastic. So that's what I'm using for this application. Now before I do the back panel, just double checking, jack shaft is in, the tabs are bent over. The oil gallery, I put the plug back in. There's thread sealant around that, so that's good to go. There's another oil gallery plug here. Same thing, that's pushed in, and thread sealant around that, that's good to go. This face, I went over it with a razor blade just to make sure there wasn't any paint that came off the block around the corner. And then I acetoned everything. So it's beautiful, it's clean, and we're ready to go. All right, it's going to 8 foot-pounds. There's an O-ring that goes in here. I'm just putting a little oil on it to lubricate it. And I need to work it in this groove. Put a little assembly lube on the sprockets. Gotta let the chain just hang here for now. They don't give you instructions for what bolts go where, but it's kind of self-explanatory. Snug everything up, and then we'll torque it down. 8 foot-pounds. 5/16 gets 15 foot-pounds. That's good. I'm going to clean up some of the gasket material that oozed out. Put a little too much on, but that's okay. It's not that bad on the inside. All right, today we got to do the rear main seal before we put the oil pan on. So I've got the engine off the engine stand, held up by the engine hoist, and put some lubricant on the back of the crank, some oil, and we're ready to put the rear main seal on. Got the rear main seal here in the housing. All I did was heat up the housing with a heat gun, and I put some gasket sealer on the outside of the seal, between the seal and the housing. And with the housing heated up and very warm, I was able to push that in with my hands. So she's good to go. We're ready to put it on the engine. All right, I've got gasket sealer on the housing, then the gasket, and then sealer on the other side. Very, very thin coat. I don't want it oozing out everywhere. I've oiled this. I've oiled the inside of the seal. So now I'm just going to try to slide it over without making a huge mess. Okay, it's on. I'm not touching the block yet, I'm just twisting a little bit. Now I want to get my screws lined up, or my bolts. Because what you really want to do is let the bolts bring this up to the block. The reason a lot of these leak is because if you push it on and you force the housing maybe a little too far in one direction, because there is some play in it, then you open up the potential for leaks on the other side, because that gasket's not, that seal is not then perfectly centered on that crankshaft. But if you just start the bolts before you push it in, you got a better chance of that seal, because it wants to center on the crankshaft. So let it do its thing. Now I just want to slowly start to turn them in. Because even if your mating surface here isn't exact, you can fix that with some extra gasket material. You really want to focus on that seal. Alright, she's snug. Now I need to torque it. 15 foot-pounds. Alright, she's good. So let that sit up for a little bit, put it back on the engine stand, and we can put the sump on. Alright, time to put the head on. So we got a couple things to prepare first. This oil return, got to put some gasket material on that. And I've dry fit this twice, and some folks like to put this in the block first and then put the head on. In my dry fits, I did it twice, and I found it was actually easier to put this in the head, lay the head down, and then guide that into the block. So I'm going to try it that way today. I've got a stud here to help guide the head down. I'm just using one. I'm going to drop it on that stud and then position it on the front of the engine. I've got to put some gasket sealer up here, and I think we're good to go. So I'm just going to go for it and go through the process and get this head bolted up. I'm always excited when they go back together again. It's just a great feeling when all the parts on the bench are back in one piece, back in one place, and then I can get it back in the car and, you know, get all the chassis components off the floor of the shop. So I'm looking forward to making some progress here. Same stuff I used before, Toyota seal packing. Love this stuff, very, very good. I'm going to put this in the head first. So I might be off camera for a second because I don't want to position it, but I'm just putting a little gasket material on here. I don't want too much. It's really hard to know the right amount because you don't want that ooze coming out everywhere. But at the same time, you're also really nervous of not putting enough on because the last thing you want is an oil leak. So it's I don't know. Experience goes a long way knowing how much to put on. Okay, I got that in the head. And I also put the sealant on the part that's going to go in here as well. So now I need to put some on here. Get my bolt holes lined up. All right, that looks good. I try so hard to eliminate oil leaks. And it's really tough. Sometimes, no matter how careful I am with gasket material and using just the right amount in certain places, you know, you put the seals in perfectly, you got an engine, and once in a while you still get an oil leak. Super frustrating. Okay, I think we are good. Let me see if this is lined up. This is the one that's, when I was dry fitting, I had a problem with. Okay, I think it's head time. No, it's not light. That actually dropped in super easily. I'm mostly concerned with this bolt going through, not hitting that gasket. Like I said, when I was dry assembling, that's where I had the most difficulty. All right, got that started. Yes, now we can do the head bolts. All right. That's all of them. Let me see if I can start them. So all the bolts, the head studs, everything is threaded in. Now I need to torque. 60 to 80 foot-pounds seems like nothing. All right, there we go. Now I'm going to hit these other 3 bolts. These little ones only go to 15 foot-pounds. We'll let that sit for a little bit. All right, there we go. So the head's on. I'm not a big fan of these cork gaskets because they got a little cork squeezing out in locations. And with it, it brings the black sealant. So, it is what it is. I'm going to clean up what gasket material I can clean up right now, and then we'll continue. All right, what I'm doing now, cam timing is set. I had to put the seal on the back before I put the cam cover on, so I just unbolted the camshaft. I lifted up the back a little bit. I put the seal on. I got some sealant in there. So now I'm just putting these nuts back on. These are all new nylon lock nuts. I'm going to torque these down, and then we should be able to put the valve cover on. All right, all torqued to 9 foot-pounds. So now we need to put the plugs in. I'm going to add some sealant to each one of these. Right now I'm just doing the half moon portion. When I do the valve cover, I'll do the top. I notice these little half moons do stick up above the surface of the head. Because they're new. I guess they're supposed to do that. And then they'll compress when I put the valve cover on. Give this thing some more assembly lube and some oil. Actually, quite a bit here. There's no reason not to apply a lot. A little drizzle of oil. Really want to get those cam followers. Now these dreaded cork gaskets. Not a fan of the cork gasket. Not a fan. Needs a little bit of gasket material outside of this cam seal. There's a lot of surface to cover on this intake. Hope for the best result. It's just a lot of surface area on this gasket. As you torque it down, it settles, and then you got to go back around because these will be loose the second time you come around. So I'm just working around the valve cover and snugging them down a little bit as this compresses. We're starting to get to a point where we're pretty consistent now. I'm only applying about 6 foot-pound, 5 foot-pounds. But we're going to stop there and pick up at the next step. Alright guys, that is it for today. We made it pretty far in the engine. I did not cover the timing chain. I realized that. I think, I don't know if it wasn't recording or what, but the timing was very, very simple on this engine. I just followed the instructions. I put the chain on and tightened up the tensioner and turned the engine over, and those timing marks were dead on. So it was super easy. There was no drama there whatsoever. A lot easier than I expected. But next time we are going to be putting the engine back in the car, hooking up the suspension, looking at things like brakes, cooling lines, and stuff like that. So until then, I'll see ya.